Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming out today to raise your voices in united protest against this government's unconstitutional and unlawful attempt to introduce legislation that coerces and blackmails the Australian public into undergoing a medical procedure that they would otherwise refuse to consent to. It is encouraging to see that there are still Australians who believe in the power and the importance of our Constitution, who believe in the importance of honouring human rights and the individual's right to autonomy over their body. It is heartening to see that there are still Australians who believe in the ideals and ethics of freedom and democracy, ideologies that lately seem to be dying at alarming rates. You will find a table over here today containing letters of will that you can sign in protest of this legislation, if you haven't done so yet. We will be sending them in to the relevant ministers and MPs on your behalf. If you are listening to this via the internet at a later date and are not able to join us here today, you can visit the No Jab, No Pay, No Way website on Weebly, as well as find the letters on our Will Be Done Restore Democracy Facebook page. By introducing this legislation, the Australian government is acting outside of its constitutional powers. Section 51(23) states, "The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have the power to make laws for the peace, order and good governance of the Commonwealth with respect to the provision of maternity allowances, widows' pensions, child endowment, unemployment, pharmaceutical, sickness and hospital benefits, medical and dental services, but not so as to authorise any form of civil conscription." In layman's terms, this means that the government cannot force any Australian to participate in any medical treatment or service by any means. People have argued that this is not what is meant by this section, but in the judge's summary in the High Court in 1949, in the case of the British Medical Association versus the Commonwealth, in which this section of the Constitution was examined as part of the case, the judges said that it did indeed represent the inability of the government to force the public or private sector into any form of medical service or treatment. Compulsion of medical services to any extent or of any nature, whether legal, by the imposition of penalties, practical, by any other means, direct or indirect, could not be authorised. By introducing this legislation, the Australian government is also breaching all informed consent laws. Every state in Australia has informed consent laws. The Australian Immunisation Handbook, distributed by the Australian Government, in section 2.1.3 reads, "Valid consent. For consent to be legally valid, the following elements must be present. It must be given by a person with legal capacity and of sufficient intellectual capacity to understand the implications of being vaccinated. It must be given voluntarily, in the absence of undue pressure, coercion or manipulation. It must cover the specific procedure to be performed, and it can only be given after the potential risks and benefits of the relevant vaccine, any risks of not having it, and any alternative options have been explained to the individual." The proposed legislation by the Australian Government to withhold benefits unless a person has their child vaccinated is no uncertain terms coercion, pressure, force and tantamount to blackmail. It is outrageous that this government, charged with the protection of its population's rights, freedoms and safeties, is completely ignoring its own laws. It is even more unbelievable that they ignore the international governing rights of the individual to informed consent as stated in the UN's Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights. They are also ignoring the right to medical freedom and bodily integrity as noted in the International Human Rights Charter. It is clear that the government's proposed no jab, no pay legislation violates this basic tenet. Judy Weilerman of Vaccination Decisions website writes, while the Australian government states vaccination in Australia is not compulsory, the government is using employment and financial incentives, which is coercion, to remove the free choice of Australians to use vaccines. There are requirements in place in some Australian workplaces that mandate recommended vaccines for individuals in order to be employed. This is removing our rights in a discriminatory manner, and this is occurring in Australia even though the government states that vaccination is not compulsory. Judy Weilerman of Vaccination Decisions has been working long and hard on a proposed piece of legislation which can help protect our rights once and for all, and I would urge you to visit her website and support this action. Our right to freely choose vaccines needs to be protected attribute in the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Bill. This is necessary because the public is accepting vaccines without being informed of the risks, the ingredients, or about the way vaccines are tested and monitored. The injection of substances into the human body is an individual choice, and if people are being refused jobs and welfare benefits, then this discrimination is infringing on our human right to choose what we inject into our own bodies. We cannot be silent and allow this or future governments to remove our right to choose what medical procedure is safe for ourselves and our children. Many have said that the argument over this legislation is not about the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, but about our right to choose. And while this is fundamentally correct, at the heart of the right to choose issue is the question of safety of the vaccines. For many, this is what leads them not to vaccinate. We have the right to choose the safest option to protect our children and ourselves. So the question of safety and efficacy must be included in the debate, and I will address some of those issues now. There is not a one-size-fits-all safety test for any pharmaceutical drug. All of them, right down to the common aspirin, can have devastating side effects on certain people. While safe for some, they are fatally unsafe for others. There are numerous scientific peer-reviewed papers that show the dangerous side effects of vaccines, and there are numerous vaccines that contain ingredients whose effects are neurological. No medical procedure or pharmaceutical product comes without side effects. This is not in question. This has been documented and proven time and time again over the course of medical history. The vaccine inserts, if your doctor has ever read them to you as required by Australian law, will tell you all the various adverse side effects from the mild to the fatal. Today your child will receive 49 doses of 14 vaccines before the age of 6. This schedule has never been tested or studied for safety. And yet this government wants to force the Australian public to vaccinate their children through financial and economic coercion on an untested medical regime. That equates to nothing short of experimentation.
Good point. Good point, man.
The Australian government want you to ignore your concerns for the safety of your child and comply with the removal of your right to choose what medical treatments are best for you and your children based on propaganda and an aggressive sales pitch from the pharmaceutical industry and its lobbyists. While ever there is a lack of consensus on the safety of a product in a public health policy, it is unethical to coerce or use mandatory strategies to enforce that medical procedure. The use of heavy metals in vaccines and their dangers is at the core of most of the safety debates across the world. Though one can see clearly that the science supports the dangers to the human body, especially the infant, from the injection of mercury and aluminium. Yet this fact is all too often ignored. While the dangers of mercury in vaccines has occupied the media's front page of the safety debate over the past decade, aluminium has been undergoing intense scrutiny as well, yet it is for the most part ignored by the mainstream media. Mercury alone in the human body is toxic, no matter in what dose. Aluminium injected into the human body is toxic, no matter in what dose. But combine them and you have a ticking time bomb of adverse reactions within the body waiting to go off. This is not up for debate. The science agrees. The guidelines and safety levels have been established, yet the vaccine industry seems to be exempt from following them, and the media seems loath to report on it. The Hep B vaccine, which is given to babies at birth, contains 250 micrograms of aluminium. This vaccine alone contains 14 times the so-called safe amount of aluminium that is FDA approved. By the time your child is 6 months of age, they will have had up to 3 rounds of 8 vaccines for a total of over 1,000 micromilligrams of aluminium. This amount is above the recommended safe amount for a 350-pound adult, and it is being injected into a 6-month-old infant. Is it any wonder why parents who have done their due diligence are concerned? Yehuda Schoenfeld is known throughout the medical community as the godfather of autoimmunity. The Israeli-born clinician has spent more than 3 decades studying the human immune system and is at the pinnacle of his profession. He wrote the textbooks on autoimmunity. He is also the editor of 3 medical journals and author of more than 1,500 research papers and founder for the International Congress on Autoimmunity. Recently, the godfather of autoimmunology has pointed to vaccines, specifically aluminium, as a significant contributor to the growing global epidemic of autoimmune diseases. There is a huge body of research that's poured in over the past 15 years that points to the dangers of aluminium in vaccines. So when immunologists around the world, including the world's leading authority on autoimmunity, are saying it's time to take vaccines back to the drawing board, shouldn't we be listening? While ever these questions are still being asked, the government has no right to financially coerce and force Australians to participate in a vaccination schedule that has been shown not only to be dangerous but ineffective. We should be adopting the precautionary principle when it comes to the health of well-being of our kids, and that is a right all parents are entitled to. This is just the tip of the iceberg in the safety debate, and I do not have time to go over every safety concern. But while ever there is no consensus in the medical industry worldwide on the safety of vaccines, then financially coerced forced vaccination should not be allowed to be implemented. So we ask the question, is history repeating itself? There is a growing list of substances that were once deemed safe by science and our governments, yet time proved that they were not, that they were in fact deadly, and that the science that initially spoke to their safety was flawed, fueled primarily by the wheel of industry and the almighty dollar. Asbestos was once hailed as a wonder product and deemed totally safe, yet as early as the 1930s, medical science began to show the connection between asbestos and the deadly cancer we now know as mesothelioma. Nonetheless, asbestos remained in widespread use throughout the 20th century, until eventually, after decades of a small percentage of people continually voicing their concerns, people started to listen, and the rising public anger at the asbestos industry for concealing the risks of asbestos eventually led to regulatory action. Unfortunately, asbestos history will show regulatory efforts to be a little too late for countless workers and consumers already exposed to asbestos. Everyone knows a little bit about the rise and fall of DDT, how it was once hailed as a great boon to mankind, how useful it was in the field and garden, house and yard, and how at last, to our dismay, it was unmasked as a killer, the chemical threat to our environment and our health. For decades, objectors to the safety of DDT were ignored, yet once again, finally, the voices of that small percent of objectors were heard, and governments around the world have begun to implement their phase-out policy. Once again, in a too late move for many workers and consumers already exposed. And of course, we all remember those cigarette ads where doctors were lounging back on their desks, sucking back a Camel, decrying their safety. And we all remember how the objectors to the safety of cigarettes were treated by the media and the tobacco companies. But yet again, finally, the research caught up with the small percent of objectors and the health warnings began. Are we seeing a pattern here? The list of substances once deemed safe and now found not to be is growing decade by decade. Time and time again we see industry profit being put above public health. Time and time again we see the precautionary principle being ignored. Conscientious objectors to vaccinations are the canaries in the coal mine. Like so many minority voices that have come before them, the objectors of asbestos, DDT and smoking were at first ridiculed, ignored and denigrated. But when their warnings were eventually found to be correct, were they apologised to? Were they vindicated? No, they were not. It was quietly put on the back page and ignored, but the new safety measures rolled in without a whisper. The same will be true of those loud voices here today who are screaming the warnings of vaccines, fluorides, GMOs and more. Isn't it time we listen to history? Isn't it time we stopped putting profit before caution? Isn't it time we learnt from our past mistakes? I say it is.
Yes.
I say it's time we listen to history and those small percent of voices who are crying out the warnings, and not to what those with a financially invested interest in the end product have to say. Because when your research team is connected to your bottom line, history proves we cannot trust you. Earlier, I read to you the Informed Consent Guidelines as printed in the Australian Immunisation Handbook 10th edition. In that section, condition number 4 stated, for consent to be legally valid, any alternative options must be explained to the individual. I can assure you that in 80% of cases across Australia, the potential risks of vaccination are not discussed with parents before their child is vaccinated. I know I wasn't, and I was not informed of all the dangers. And in 100% of cases, they will not be informed of the alternatives to vaccination. Does our government even know that there are viable, proven, clinically tested alternatives to vaccination? Most probably not. And if they do, they are guilty of withholding this information to the public at the expense of our children's lives and for the benefit of the drug industry. For over 70 years, doctors all over the world have been treating patients with high mega doses of ascorbic acid and documenting their success. For about the same period of time, the pharmaceutical-controlled medical industry has ignored their work. It is time to realise that the medical industry has nothing to do with health. and everything to do with profit. They do not care how many children they injure or kill as long as their profits remain. Ascorbic acid, or as it is more commonly known, vitamin C, has been a proven, effective, natural antibiotic, antiviral and antitoxin for over 70 years. Since the early part of the 20th century, doctors have been using high doses of vitamin C to treat and cure a variety of childhood infectious diseases. Dr. Frederick Klenner in the USA had been using vitamin C as an antibiotic, antitoxin and antihistamine for 35 years in his practice. He's employed it with success against meningitis, tetanus, encephalitis, and had a 100% cure rate when using it with polio. Why has he and all the other doctors and researchers the world over who have studied and used high-dose vitamin C therapy been ignored? I would suggest it is a combination of arrogance, ignorance and greed. There is no other logical reason for the complete suppression in the medical industry on the value, success and safety of high-dose vitamin C therapy, especially in the area of childhood illness. So how can high-dose vitamin C therapy be an effective and safe alternative to vaccination? Because it has been clinically proven, documented, to prevent and treat and cure hepatitis, tetanus, chickenpox, measles, whooping cough, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, pneumonia, viral encephalitis, polio, tuberculosis, meningitis, septicemia, scarlet fever, strep, brucellosis, typhoid, dysentery, malaria and influenza. It can even chelate heavy metals from the body, a big relief for parents whose children have been injured from the aluminium and mercury in vaccines. It's time we called for the medical community at large to stop pushing dangerous and deadly pharmaceutical products down our throats and start looking at the proven and effective, safer alternatives. I would like to close by saying thank you to the organisers of today's rally for allowing me the time to speak to you all. We must not allow our rights to be taken without a fight, and we must not allow the government to get away with financial blackmail. When a side effect of a vaccine is death, no matter how rare that is, as parents, we and we alone should have the right to decide if that risk is worth it, especially since, as I have outlined, there is a proven, safe, effective prevention and treatment as an alternative. It's time we get loud enough so that this government, who works for us, stops allowing this pariah-filled medical industry to govern our lives, and instead does what it has been paid to do by us, the taxpayers. It is time we remind them that they do not have the right to control this country without consultation. They are servants to the people, and it's time they did their jobs. It is time that they stood up for our rights and our health and our safety and protect the people for whom they are supposed to represent, instead of protecting the financial interests of Big Pharma and the medical industry. Thank you.